Governor Chris Christie, former governor of New Jersey, was a Republican candidate for the presidency uh, leading into the 2024 New Hampshire Republican primary. Thank you very much for joining us. And we'll get right into starting. So, Governor, the probably the biggest talking point around your campaign this time around has been the former president. And so I'm wondering what your thoughts are on why Donald Trump, with all we've seen of him, is backed by so many Republicans over candidates such as yourself, who ought to be getting every consideration given their qualifications. Is the party broken?
Well, look, what I think is the country's broken, and I think this is an indication of it. Our political system is broken. This is another indication of it. Um, and I think that when you have such a divided country and a divided party, the most divisive figure in the country gains traction. And it's up to the country to decide whether or not they're tired of the anger and the division, the lack of accomplishment that we've seen in this country from a governmental perspective. And I think right now the answer is that they care more about their wearing their jerseys all the time, their red jersey or their blue jersey, than they care about necessarily, accomplishing something in government. They want to just win the argument. But winning the argument in this instance by backing Donald Trump is I think, a losing proposition for my party in the general election. I don't think Donald Trump would be elected in a general election. And I think if he were to be elected, it would be a bad thing for the country, just based upon what he's saying in his campaign. That, the biggest contrast is 8 years ago, he said, "I am your voice." And 8 years later, he's saying, "I am your retribution." And that's the argument we're making. I think that right now, partisanship is winning over common sense.
Okay.
All
right.
Bill,
So
did you follow?
we know, I'm sorry, we know that here in New Hampshire, as well as anybody, that polls can be off and inaccurate. But it's kind of hard to imagine that they're off by the margin that Trump now enjoys in the Republican race. So at this point, he would easily win the nomination. Given that, what's your path to the White House? What needs to happen for you to become president?
Well, first I have to do very well here in New Hampshire in 18 days. And very well means I need to come in at least second place. And then I think, what happens is, if you look at some of the polling that came out of South Carolina just yesterday, as Governor Haley losing in her own home state by 29 points. I think if she doesn't beat me here and she loses, by a significant margin in her own home state, I don't really know what the future of her campaign is. And Ron DeSantis, who is really the only other serious candidate left in the race, he's supposedly now behind by 25 to 30 in Iowa, a place where he said he was going to win. I don't know if he survives past even Iowa on Monday, a week from Monday. So the path is come here in second place in New Hampshire, then go directly to Michigan, where it has very similar rules to New Hampshire. Same-day registration, independents can vote in the primary, where I think it'll be a much more competitive electorate, much closer to a general electorate than what you're seeing, let's say, for instance, in Iowa or in South Carolina. And then by that time, if what I'm supposing will happen, which is DeSantis leaves after Iowa and Haley has to leave after South Carolina, then it's a one-on-one race between me and Trump. And at that point, I think then for the first time, he'll have to stand next to someone who's willing to take him on, which hasn't happened before. A direct and clear contrast can be drawn between the two of us. And I think that's the moment when I'll have my opportunity. And we'll see if that comes. If my suppositions turn out correct, if they come, I think that will wind up being a real stark moment in the campaign. Second piece of that also is that we know that Donald Trump has a number of legal issues that are going to be becoming more and more ripe as we get from winter into spring. His trial on the January 6th matter in Washington, his defamation case in New York with Jean Carroll, his civil fraud trial, which is reaching its conclusion now in New York, and now the ballot challenges that he has in Colorado and Maine. And there's another, I think, 11 states that have them pending at the moment. So all those things start to crystallize as well. So some of it is things that I have to do in terms of my performance, and some of them are outside forces that are usually what you need to take down an incumbent. And that's the essence of what this campaign has been from the beginning. It's been running essentially against an incumbent president, given that Donald Trump has been the nominee twice and is running as an incumbent.
Okay. So the national perception is that you're running mainly to stop his reelection, but this isn't your first rodeo, and every candidate has to be prepared to actually do the job if elected. So let's kind of go around and talk a little bit about the Chris Christie agenda.
Most presidential elections hinge on the economy. Coming out of the COVID pandemic, there was a lot of predictions of a recession, and that didn't happen. And a lot of the indicators are fairly positive right now: stock market, employment. So what would you do how do you assess the state of the economy, and what would you do to improve it?
Well, my concerns about the economy are fewfold. First is inflation, which is still a problem, and you can see it here in New Hampshire, and I've certainly heard it from voters here. And while it has improved over its height about 18 months ago or so, it is still significantly higher than it was when Joe Biden came into office. And people are holding him to account for that. And whether it's gasoline and fuel oil prices, whether it's grocery prices, whether it's the housing shortage that we're seeing is causing, a huge problem in the country, all those things are being felt by the public, and they want you to address them. So on inflation, I think there's two things that I would do. First is that we have to reduce what we're spending from a federal government perspective. At a 1.7 or $8 trillion deficit this year. So I would do two things. First, I would return immediately to pre-COVID levels of spending. That would take about $1 trillion off of the annual deficit. And I just don't think there's any justification anymore from a public policy perspective for spending at that level. There was previously some justification for that because of COVID, but there isn't anymore. Secondly, on the spending front, I would do what we did in New Jersey. I inherited in 2010 an $11 billion deficit on a $29 billion budget and had 5 months to resolve it when I came to office. And we went to zero-based budget, which was just theoretical to me before I actually had to do it. And we actually have to do it. It's no fun, but it is effective. Get every department in there and start them at zero and say every program has to be justified. We wound up eliminating 832 programs as a result. And we balanced our budget without raising taxes and kept that discipline going forward so that in my 8 years as governor, I'm spending a total of 15%. That's the kind of discipline we need at the federal level. Now, it's not going to happen in 4 years at the federal level. It's really going to take 6 to 8 years to get this under control. And I'll pay a price politically for it. I did it. I paid that price in New Jersey, but I did that first round of nominations. My job approval went from 55 to 38. So people feel it, and it won't be universally popular. But I think that when inflation comes down and interest rates come down, and you can point to this as one of the reasons, I think that will help to balance it off politically. Secondly, I think in the energy issue, we have to do three things because that contributes more immediately and more painfully for most people to inflation than almost anything else. So the first is that we need to reopen our development of our fossil fuels as frequently and as openly as we can across the country. So, for instance, while we're still net right now creating more fossil fuels than we did when Joe Biden came in, it's a net number, and so it's balanced off against what we're importing, right? So we're importing more as well, and so what we need to do is increase what we're doing domestically. So in states like North Dakota, in Alaska, in Texas, in Oklahoma, to lift some of the environmental restrictions that Biden has put on the production, off of the production of that, to increase the supply. That would be have an immediate effect on the long-term market price of oil because of the way it runs the futures market. Second, I would put a much greater emphasis on nuclear power. This comes from my experience in New Jersey as well. We're the most densely populated state in the country, yet 53% of our electricity is created by nuclear. And we've operated those nuclear power plants effectively, safely for 50 years now. And so the 3 Mile Island day of nuclear power is long gone, and the technology is significantly better, and it adds nothing to our carbon footprint. And I think it's important to deal with climate issues at the same time. You can't rely just on fossil fuels to do this. And so creating a more stable base for our electricity in particular will help us as well. Third, I would use the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to override the decisions of states like New York, which have not permitted the building of pipelines from Pennsylvania here to New England. Because what's happening here in New England is you get a double whammy, that not only the general price of oil, but with home heating oil as almost the exclusive fuel to be able to heat homes in winters like we're starting to feel today. We need to get optionality for people, and we do have an abundance of natural gas in this country. I built 2 new pipelines when I was governor of New Jersey, Pennsylvania to New Jersey. Saw the impact that it had on energy prices for folks in my state, and they were significant. So I think allowing that pipeline building to be done in the areas of the country where it's necessary, opening up much more production in the country, because we can be energy independent, and we're close to energy independent now. But what I really want us to become is energy exporters to our allies, because that last piece of it would help as well to be able to have our allies not have to rely on Russia, Venezuela, the Middle East for their energy, and be able to be a contributor to that would help to stabilize things in the world as well. So that's those 2 biggest pieces on the economic front. The last thing I'd say on the economic front is there's been a lot of conversation about student loans, student loan forgiveness. I'm not an advocate for broad student loan forgiveness, but I do think that in the area of healthcare in this country, that we need more healthcare practitioners, particularly in mental health and substance abuse areas, but also general practitioners as well. And I would offer student loan forgiveness if folks were going into those fields were committing 10 years of their career to working exclusively in those fields. In return, I would give student loan forgiveness for those folks. And I think that could help to build up a healthcare industry that right now is understaffed in this country with physicians, nurses, counselors, social workers. And when you look at both the mental health crisis I think we're having in the country, especially in the post-COVID time, and you look at the drug abuse problem in the country and the lack of treatment facilities to deal with that problem, that's also going to help us from a social perspective and an economic perspective.
A big problem in New Hampshire is lack of affordable housing, and the vacancy rate for apartments is like 1% or less in some places. Do you see that as a significant problem, and what we should do about it?
I do see it as a significant problem. I do think when interest rates come down, it will help to ease that a little bit because it will make it more profitable to even build affordable housing. Right now, I think the squeeze that you're seeing with developers is that if they have to spend 6 or 7% to borrow money, the margin they can make on affordable housing is so much less than on other market rate housing that the interest rates affects that the most. And I think that's the squeeze we're seeing most particularly and urgently right now. So one way to do it is to bring those interest rates down. But secondly, I would reconfigure the mission of HUD, of the Department of Housing and Urban Development. I don't think they have focused nearly enough on making affordable subsidies for affordable housing available. I think their emphasis has been on kind of Section 8 subsidies. Right now, that's the issue is, as you put it, it's not that people don't have the money to be able to rent. There's just not the available stock to do it. So I think we have to react to what's happening in the country and reconfigure some of that money to go into incentivizing and subsidizing to make it profitable, the development of more affordable housing, both single family units and multifamily units. And the way I would do that is to do it through the individual states. So have HUD block grants that go to the governors, because they're going to know, Sununu will know much better here what's needed. Is it single family housing that's more urgently needed? Is it multifamily housing that's more urgently needed? What parts of the state is it most urgently needed? I always fear a federal plan will be a meat axe rather than a scalpel. And I would rather fund the governors directly and then hold them accountable and say, look, you're going to only continue to get this funding going forward if you're showing increase in your housing stock. If not, then we're going to take over the program from you. I can tell you from my experience that most of the time when governors are given federal money without strings, they don't want strings on it. So they're going to work hard to make it effective. So that's the other part I would do on affordable housing, reconfigure what HUD's mission is and make it much more of a block granting department to governors to be able to deal with, because it's not just here in New Hampshire, as you probably know. I mean, the affordable housing issue is probably really stark in at least 30 of the states in the country. And so we need to get on that and change what HUD's doing.
I'd like to loop back to healthcare, which you mentioned earlier. The cost of healthcare is a real kitchen table issue for Americans. And I read a Bloomberg piece about the Affordable Care Act, which mentioned the pluses and the minuses, but the bottom line was healthcare isn't really affordable and healthcare insurance isn't affordable. So how would you address that?
Well, I think it shows that the limits of the ACA, and it's the limit of any type of governmental intervention in this. It often doesn't deal with prices. What it deals with is making a government provided solution more available, but it doesn't deal with the underlying price. We're a capitalist society, so whether we like it or not, market forces are always going to have the biggest impact on that. So one of the things I think that we need to do is to strip away some of the requirements of ACA. And by that, I mean all of the different mandates of particular coverage in there, and start to allow there to be all different types of policies that are offered, not only with different levels of mandates, because for instance, the coverage that my wife and I need in our early 60s is significantly different than the coverage that my son at 30 without any children right now might want to be able to purchase. ACA is not very flexible in that regard. So I think you need to strip away, and it's because of the mandates that ACA has about all the different things that must be covered. And that's going to drive cost. So let's reduce those mandates and make them more flexible. You can still have policies that are available with those type of coverages, but recognizing that you're going to have to pay for them. Secondly, on that front, I would look at the way we're selling insurance, health insurance across the country is still state by state by state. And I think that provides much fewer opportunities for folks. You look at now in Florida and around State, there's a huge insurance crisis going on in every level of insurance because of the fact that they're not opening things up in Florida in the way that they should. I think we need to get rid of the requirements of each state having their own mandates. Let's have insurance companies be able to sell across state lines. I think it'll increase the pool. The increasing of the pool of insurance, as you know, lessens the risk for the companies, and I think that need to lower prices. Last piece is on pharmaceutical costs, because if you look at the way most people get healthcare treatment now, it's predominantly through taking prescription drugs. You know, most people can treat most of the ailments they have if they can get in to see a doctor through a prescription, without having to go in for inpatient hospital care, or other types of hospital-based treatment. So we need to get a handle on lowering the cost of prescription drugs. I think the single biggest driver for that now are pharmacy benefit managers, who are essentially the middlemen that are between the pharmaceutical companies and the pharmacies. And they provide seemingly little service except for distribution. But for that, you're seeing, for instance, on some of the newest drugs that are available out there, the pharmaceutical companies are offering anywhere from 60 to 70% rebates. Those rebates almost never reach the patient. Most of the rebates are being skimmed off by the PBMs as their fee for administering the program. And so, for instance, in New Jersey, one of the things that we did to show you how much waste there is in that middleman, we're the first state in the country to do this, and now I think it's up to 25. We're the first state to do a reverse auction for PBM services and say, you come in and tell us how much you can cut your price to keep the volume of this business. We went through 3 rounds of bidding. In every year since I did that, which was in 2014, the price of their services was reduced by $500 million in New Jersey just for public sector employees, because I don't administer it for any other folks. It's for the 60,000 state employees. We lowered the cost by $500 million. That's not a national solution to the problem, but I pointed out as an example of how much waste there is in there. They could lower their fees by $500 million and still be profitable. So there's a ton of waste there. I think we need to eliminate those middlemen. And the reason I know they're not necessary is, you know, who owns now most of the PBMs are the insurance companies, the health insurance companies. So they see that they're able to then charge premiums based upon the price that ultimately gets to the counter. And they're collecting the VIG in between, making a profit off of it. There is no reason now why we can't have pharmaceutical companies working directly with pharmacies, because if you look at now, there are so few local pharmacies anymore. The system has changed to CVS and Walgreens, and the big ones predominating in most communities. We should eliminate those middle folks, allow those rebates that are being given by the pharmaceutical companies to pass directly to the customers. If we were able to do that, we'd reduce the prices by probably close to 50 to 60%. That would be an enormous help in terms of healthcare costs that you mentioned people are talking about around the kitchen table. We all do, like all of us. Even if you have good insurance, you know what you're paying in terms of your co-pays and all the rest are pretty staggering for a lot of families. So I would work on that, and I would also ban pharmaceutical advertising. I mean, enough already. They're telling us about all these different drugs. Everybody looks healthy and happy as they're wandering around and swimming in the lake and playing on the beach and all that stuff. And it's like, if only I could take that drug, well, I would be just like them. They're spending billions, tens of billions every year on that. I think it's one of the things that aggravates the public. Pharmaceutical companies in this country have done predominantly really outstanding work in providing us with cutting edge treatments and cures for things. But the reason I tell them all the time, in New Jersey is the biggest pharmaceutical state in the country. And so I've been exposed to a lot of the CEOs over the course of my career and said to them, you're hurting yourself by doing this. Because when the public sees you spending all that money on that, and then they're paying what they're paying at the counter, they honestly believe that you're shafting them. And you're spending all this money to try to get them to do what? Go to the doctor and say, I want Eliquis, or I want Viagra, or I want whatever it is. Most people don't do that. What most people do is they go to the doctor and say, this hurts, this is a problem. What do I take? And the doctor makes a decision. I have no problem with them marketing directly to doctors about the advantage of the drugs, as they always have. But this broad public advertising is too costly, and I think leads to less effective medical care for people. So let's strip that cost out as well.
So what about the opioid epidemic? What do you think the federal government should be doing to address that?
Well, I chaired Trump's commission on opioid and drug abuse. We came up with over 60 recommendations to the administration. And so I if you just read the executive summary, I urge you to go. It's still up on the White House website. Because I spent months. It was myself, Charlie Baker was on the commission. I appointed him as well. Roy Cooper, the governor of North Carolina, on the commission as well. Patrick Kennedy was on the commission, and we traveled around the country, had hearings, did a ton of work on it. So let me just highlight a few things from that. I think, first off, we have to end the fallacy that we're going to be able to arrest our way out of this problem. We're not. And the more we arrest drug addicts and put them in jail and have them get out of jail still addicted to drugs, it is a never-ending cycle for those people and for our society that ultimately is going to lead to death for those folks. So we need to make treatment much more broadly available. Part of that is part of my incentive for the student loan forgiveness is to get more people in this area to be able to provide that care. And we made drug court in New Jersey mandatory, and we made treatment mandatory for people who are coming through drug court as addicts. I think we should have national drug courts in the federal courts as well, because many of these people either get charged federally as well, and they have no ability to be able to access care and get alternatives to incarceration. Incarceration, in my view, should be reserved for the people who profit from the drug trade, not the people who are the victims of it. Secondly, the president needs to talk about this the way it is. Disease. It's no different than cancer or diabetes or heart disease. It is a disease, and when people get it, they need to be treated. Veterans in particular are susceptible to this from the mental health side of things as well. So one of the things I would do is make any veteran who is honorably discharged from the military should be able to get drug treatment anywhere they want to go in the country, and the federal government should pay for it. Drug treatment and mental health treatment. That's the least we owe our veterans, is to do that for them. They should not have to wait for the VA. We have thousands of suicides a year of veterans because they can't get treatment, because they're waiting to get called off VA waiting lists. So I think we need to deal with that. Third, one of the things we did in New Jersey was when we did criminal justice reform, it had the impact that I hoped it would, which was to lessen our prison population. It allowed the Department of Corrections to come to me and say, we can close 2 state prisons. I closed one of them, but on the second one, which was at Fort Dix, at our military base in New Jersey, we converted it from a regular prison to a drug treatment prison. And so what we did was, with folks who came into the system with a recognized drug or alcohol abuse problem, the last year of their sentence was spent in that facility. And we had treatment professionals there. We had folks who were able to use where appropriate medication-assisted treatment, and to start that process as they're ending their time in jail. Then what we would do for those folks is, if appropriate, we qualify them for Medicaid, get them their Medicaid card before they left prison, and give them their first prescriptions for medication-assisted treatment on the way out. You saw a reduction of recidivism among those folks of nearly 40% after going through that program in our state. I think we should institute that in federal correctional institutions as well. The revolving door that's going on is because we have this fallacy that people go into jail drug addicted. Well, they can't get drugs in jail, for sake, so they'll come out clean. No, they get drugs in jail. Drugs get smuggled from jail. Prison guards sell them drugs. It happens. And if people aren't treated, they don't have a chance to succeed at it. We need to deal with that population as well. Lastly, I think that we need to deal from an educational perspective in our schools with talking to kids frankly about what drug abuse is all about, and making sure that they understand, if they fall into it, what options are available to them to get treatment, and educate parents as well. We're not having nearly enough of that, and the stigma that's connected to this is because we don't talk about it. So families won't come forward and ask for help. They're ashamed to ask for help. They're ashamed they're going to be judged. They're bad parents, bad siblings, because their loved ones have this problem. We need to start talking about that in the schools very early on so that we treat it just like any other disease. The child with diabetes, they're not afraid to come forward and say, okay, school nurse, my son or daughter needs to have their insulin shots. We need your help with this. Well, if they have a 15-year-old opioid addicted kid who's not going back to school and is on medication assisted treatment, then we need to have a welcoming environment where school helps to make sure that that's administered in the right way. So my whole point on the issue is that I come at this with a history of being a prosecutor. And so I'm not afraid to prosecute people who have broken the law. But what I've learned over the course of my career is that that's not going to solve the drug problem in this country. We should jail the people who are profiting from it, but everybody else, we should treat it as the disease that it is. And by getting more people into the profession of providing the treatment, making treatment more broadly available to folks. Last thing I would say on health insurance is that I would make it a federal law that drug abuse treatment, substance abuse treatment has to be covered under family medical policies. Doesn't have to be covered under individual policies if you don't want an individual policy. But once you have children, we need to have substance abuse treatment required to be treated by insurance companies. And they make it very difficult for a lot of families to afford it. And that should not be the case. If you pay for a family policy, part of having a family is you might have one of your family members fall victim to this disease. If you do, it shouldn't be a death sentence. They should be able to be treated.
I was interested to see in a recent Associated Press University of Chicago poll that immigration still remains one of the top issues, but foreign policy has also climbed in the minds of voters. So I'm wondering if you think voters are connecting the dots now, that the instability in the world is maybe leading to asylum seekers, and I'm wondering what your take is on what we should do about asylum seekers and voters.
Well, I unfortunately, I don't think they're connecting the dots on that part of it. I think that what you're seeing in the rising foreign policy concerns are the wars in Ukraine and in the Middle East, and the concern about China and Taiwan are making people more concerned about it. I don't think they're connecting dots yet to asylum seeking. I wish they would, but I haven't at least felt that in conversations with voters. And obviously over the last 9 months, I've been having a lot of them. I haven't seen it. But on asylum seekers, look, this is one of the areas of this campaign that to me has been the most frustrating, because my adversaries in this race all take this like TV tough guy approach to asylum seekers, right? So Trump is back to build the wall and take all these people who are poisoning the blood of the country and kicking them out and all the rest. He didn't build the wall the last time. My guess is if he ever became president again, he still wouldn't build it. He built 52 miles of new wall in 4 years, so he only needs another 115 years as president to finish the border wall. So, that's his brand of TV tough guy talk. DeSantis is shoot him stone cold dead at the border. Now, I don't know who the Customs and Border Patrol officers or the National Guardsmen and women he's going to get to pull that trigger, just because the person has a backpack, which is one of his criteria for shooting somebody, because then they must be a drug dealer. Again, and he says he's going to build the wall and Mexico's going to pay for it. He's back to that promise. That was a complete bull line 8 years ago when I was on that stage with Donald Trump, and those of us who said he would never do it haven't gotten credited now 8 years later with having been right, that he would never do it, and Mexico would never pay for it. And then you got Nikki Haley saying that, she's going to, deport 8 million people who've come into the country. Obviously a comment from someone who's never been in law enforcement. Like, I look at it all the time as if when I was a U.S. attorney, and New Jersey is the most ethnically diverse state in the country. So let's say the Attorney General of the United States, which is, I assume, the way this would be done in a Haley administration, came down to the U.S. attorneys and said, okay, we're going to round up all the people who are here illegally. You've got to jail them, and then we're going to deport them. In my state, how exactly do I go about doing that? Do I start profiling people based upon the way they look or the language they're speaking? how do I figure it out? If they're here illegally and they're not documented, and they've now come into, let's use one example. We have an enormous Hispanic Latino community in Hudson County, New Jersey City, Union City. You go into those neighborhoods, Spanish is spoken more predominantly than English. How am I collecting these people for you? I mean, this all sounds really good. And then let's say I could collect all of the illegals who are in New Jersey. Where am I putting them while I wait to deport them? Then physically, how am I deporting them? How does that happen? And who's paying for that? I mean, this is all the ridiculousness of this campaign and how we deal with people who, most of whom are still coming to this country because they are escaping either political or economic repression in their countries of origin and just want to have an opportunity to come to the freest, richest country in the world and try to make a life for themselves. So the problem at the border now, I think, needs to be handled with some degree of experience and logic rather than, muscle flexing. So first day, I would sign an executive order to send National Guard troops to the border to help Customs and Border Patrol officers. Last month, we had 276,000 attempted entries at the southern border. These Customs and Border Patrol officers are overwhelmed. They can't deal with that kind of volume. So National Guard needs to help do that. Second, I would hire 10,000 new Customs and Border Patrol officers, but that's going to take 12 to 15 months to get done by the time you recruit them, train them, and then deploy them. And so that's not an immediate fix, but as they come online, you can pull back National Guard's folks in equal numbers to do that. Third, when you talk about them coming to the border and they come in, to the extent you want to detain people, we've got 38,000 detention beds total across the entire southern border, 276,000 entries. So now, the math isn't good there. So I would double the number of beds for detention from 38,000 to 80. Now, that would probably take 9 months to a year to do as well. So it's not an immediate fix to the problem, but it is a long-term fix to the problem. Fourth, when you deal with asylum seekers, specifically on your question, our laws say they have a right to a hearing. Well, right now, hearings are 4 years. The wait for hearings 4 years. You can't detain someone legally for 4 years. And so what happens is catch and release. You release them into the country and say, hey, by the way, 4 years, come back to El Paso. We're going to have a hearing where you can get out of the country potentially. Sure, they're going to show up. I mean, these people are immigrants. They're not dumb. And they're not coming back. If they can safely get into the interior of this country, they're not coming back to El Paso for a hearing where they might wind up getting kicked out. So they just disappear. We need to triple the number of immigration judges. The reason asylum hearings take so long is we don't have judges to process things legally. I'm not a person who says that people shouldn't get a hearing. I'm saying the hearing should be a timely one. If you triple the number of judges, the estimate is that could bring that down from 4 years to under a year. And you could detain people for under a year and make sure that they get their hearing. And then if they qualify under our asylum laws, then they're released legally into the country. And if they're not, then you can send them back. Fifth and final, all of this stuff is 4 steps in dealing with the immediate crisis. The long-term fix is we have to change our immigration. We haven't done that in 40 years. And we've been stuck in cement, both parties, on it for at least the last 20, since George W. Bush tried to fix them back when he first became president. So I would go to a merit-based immigration system. We have 6 million vacant jobs in this country. I had a guy come to a town hall meeting a couple of weeks ago here in New Hampshire. He's the son of a guy who owns an auto body shop in New Hampshire. He says his father works 7 days a week and is turning away business because he can't find anybody to hire. And you hear that from ranchers, you hear it from farmers, you hear it from folks all across our economy. That they can't find people who want to do these jobs. Our labor participation rate is down to like 62.5% in this last month. And so these are determinations that have been made by Americans. These are the jobs they don't want or can't do. Every time we've been confronted with that problem in our nation's history, what have we done? We've brought in immigrants to do this work. That's how my great-grandfather got here. My great-grandfather came here in 1901 as a stonemason from Sicily, because they were building New York City. And companies came over there and wanted to recruit Masons to come over and help build the buildings in New York City. And my grandfather waited, got his ticket. He and my great grandmother were ready to come over. My great grandmother was 9 months pregnant. So my great grandfather said, "You can stay. I'll go. And you can meet me there." She said, "Sure, no chance. I'm coming with you." So as a result, my grandfather was born in the boat on the way over here. And he's the one who told me these stories. And he said, the proudest day of his life was a day he couldn't remember. He was 4 days old when they got to Ellis Island. And when he got there, they made him an American citizen. We can't stop these stories in this country. Part of what's made this country what it is. I think people are okay with it as long as it's merit-based. That, like, okay, there is a job here for someone, or at least an industry that needs help and they qualify for it. And then those industries should be required to use E-Verify so that there's no abuse on either side. They're not unknowingly hiring people who are here illegally, which hurts everybody, or employers are not exploiting people who are here illegally, not paying them a fair wage. So you need to use E-Verify. But to get those two things, as a Republican, we're going to have to give the Democrats something. They don't want those two things, or they want other things more, right? So maybe it's federal legislation on dreamers. Maybe it's a path to citizenship for some of the people who are already in the country. But we're going to have to compromise in some way as Republicans. If we expect Democrats to compromise on merit-based immigration and on E-Verify, we're going to have to give something too. And that's where I think my background as governor of a blue state, where I had a Democratic legislature, my entire tenure, gives me the skill set to be able to actually do that, and the political will to do it. Where if you have these red state governors, they've never had to compromise on anything. So they go in there and they're like, well, the legislature is supposed to do what I told them to do. Then we generally agree on everything. They're going to go to Washington. It's going to be a rude awakening for Ron DeSantis or for Nikki Haley to actually have to deal with Democrats, which in their entire public careers they've never had to do. And Donald Trump just doesn't want to deal with anybody. He wants to be a dictator. So we need to elect somebody who actually knows how to do it, has done it, is willing to do it, and recognizes that putting points on the board will help to lower the temperature on this issue of the country as well. We see you actually accomplishing something, and the things are getting better. Because if you have a legal immigration system that can really work, it will lower the pressure at the border. And you'll have less people coming that way and more people willing to come in the front door. And I don't think we want to stop that flow coming in. We just want to control it in a way that makes it advantageous for the rest of the people in this country, as well as for the folks who are coming in. We've done it at so many other points in our history. There's no reason we can't do it now.
I
So,
think I'm turning it back to Bill.
yeah, good. Thanks. So, Governor, in Washington, in the discussions now that concerning immigration and the southern border, House leaders want to tie aid to Ukraine to that as a tit for tat kind of compromise. You've said that the U.S. should continue its aid to Ukraine so that they can defeat Russia. What, if any, limits or conditions would you put on that kind of aid?
I wouldn't put much of any limitations. If you're talking about tying it to immigration, I think that the time has passed for that to happen. The Republicans and Democrats have not been able to come to a deal. We need to get aid to Ukraine. Fact is, that is a situation that's only going to get worse, not better, without continued American military aid. And that, to me, would be a foreign policy priority. I had no problem with them trying to craft a grand compromise, if you could even call it that in the current atmosphere, of putting immigration funding in with that. But you got to be willing to say yes to a deal. And both sides are looking at how they can exploit the immigration issue for political purposes in an election year. And so I am very skeptical that they're going to be able to come to an agreement now on this. And so we need to get back to the foreign policy point of Ukraine and Israel aid has to come forward, because otherwise we're going to lose out there. Excuse me.
Bless you.
Thank you.
So in terms of Israel, well, everyone's been seeing for months now the devastation that's going on in the Gaza Strip, and knows what precipitated it. Can the U.S. continue to sit back and support Israel as it's leveling Gaza and in order to root out Hamas? Should the Palestinians that are being killed daily be seen as culpable or collateral or in need of protection? What should the U.S. policy there be?
I think the U.S. policy has to be to support Israel. I went there post the October 7th war. I'm the only candidate who has, and seen it personally. And I can tell you, when you see the inhumanity that was visited by Hamas on the Israeli civilians, and you listen to Hamas say that they want another October 7th and another and another, I don't think you can allow that military to stay at a level where they can actually visit that type of destruction on Israel again. And if Hamas were saying, okay, we're willing to agree to back off our desire to kill Jews and eliminate Israel, okay, then I think it would be appropriate for there to be a ceasefire. This will be a one-way ceasefire. If Israel stops, that just means Israel stops, and Hamas will continue. And that's the history of this conflict. And so I think we have to continue to support Israel. Now, what I would say to Israel privately is the long-term goal here is to isolate Iran. We know that Iran is the banker for Hamas, they're the banker for Hezbollah. And so the long-term interest is to isolate Iran. And the only way to do that is to get other Arab countries who want to cooperate with Israel, give them the space to do it. So the question is, are you going to completely eliminate Hamas? I don't think that's even possible. So where the real decision needs to be made here is, how much is enough? When have you degraded the Hamas military capability enough to be able to have them not be a real-time threat now? And then get to the next stage, which has to be discussed with the other Arab countries, which is what comes into Gaza post this, because certainly allowing Hamas to continue to run Gaza is not an option. So is it the Palestinian Authority? Is it some other international force that governs in Gaza? But we need to get to those conversations. So I think the private conversations with Israel is, when have you done enough to feel like your security is reasonably protected? And those are the private conversations that I hope President Biden is having with Netanyahu and the other leaders of the Israeli government over there. And that's where we eventually have to get to. But I can tell you this. You asked about, are they culpable, collateral? I think the answer is yes. There are some that are culpable. And Hamas is culpable for placing its military operations in hospitals, in schools, in apartment buildings, not spending all the aid they've gotten, the billions of dollars of aid they've gotten from this country over time, not in improving conditions in Gaza, but in building that tunnel system to obscure their military capability. You look at Gaza, and I've been there, and you see what they could develop on their waterfront there, and all the. This could become a place that has a lot of economic attraction to it. But instead of spending their money on that, the money that we've given them, that Western Europe has given, they spent it on an extensive tunnel system to continue to wage war. So they're the culpable parts. And there are some Palestinians, obviously, who are collateral damage as well. And, that's not good. But I will also say that Hamas is culpable for that even more than Israel, because they've put their people in harm's way. And, there are consequences for invading Israel and killing 1,400 civilians. And when I went and traveled in Israel with the Speaker of the Knesset, the things that I saw in the way those Israelis were murdered, and the video that I saw that 43-minute video that's been talked about. I mean, there was one where after they murdered an elderly Israeli in a kibbutz, they decapitated him with a hoe and then put the head on the end of the hoe and danced around his body with it. I mean, I don't know how you negotiate with these folks. How do you deal with people like that? So, you know, I have a lot of empathy for the Israelis in terms of how difficult this problem is to solve.
We have time for one more question.
Okay, so while we're on the topic of foreign affairs, what's the biggest threat to the United States globally, and how would you deal with it?
Look, I think the biggest long-term threat to the United States is China. And I think we have an opportunity right now to deal with it in a way that could be advantageous to the United States because of all the difficulties that are happening in China. You know, statistics just came out this week that shows that China is now 2/3 of our GDP. 3 years ago, it was as high as 85%. They're having serious economic problems in China, based in part on their one child program that existed for so long. They now have an aging labor force that's not able to support the continued growth in the economy anywhere near the rate it was going on before. They have over leveraged themselves as well with individual cities they built that nobody live in. They have some real economic problems. I don't think President Xi was in San Francisco by accident a couple of months ago. He went there because that's where American business people were gathering, and he needs continued American business investment in China to help boost their economy. And so this is a moment where I think China needs us more than we need them. And as a result, we should use that leverage in a way to try to normalize and stabilize the relationship more. We need to get them to stop with the theft of intellectual property, and we need them to stop sending fentanyl precursors to the Mexico drug cartels. Those are two of the most aggressive, offensive things that they're doing. And we should use this moment of leverage that we have to be able to negotiate rules around both of those things that reduce their impact on citizens of our country, both economically and physically. We also need to rebuild our Navy. Our Navy is at the lowest level it's been in decades in terms of its number of ships. It's in the lowest level of submarines that we've had. We need to build another shipyard in the United States, start building, and we need to build more nuclear submarines and more ships. Because to deter China, it's going to be our naval forces in the South China Sea that will do that. And if we have a military priority in this relationship with China, to me, it's not a space force. It is reconfiguring that money to the Navy and getting our Navy built back up to levels that will show the Chinese that any aggression towards Taiwan, the juice will not be worth the squeeze. And we need to make sure that we send that signal very clearly. Lastly, when Governor Haley says things like she'll end trade relations with China, this is sophomoric. I mean, we already don't have normal trade relations with China. Normal trade relations are defined as tariff-free trade relations. Trump put on, and Biden has continued, tariffs on 95% of the things that we import from China. And has it done anything to change Chinese behavior? No. All it's done is make prices higher here in the United States. Now, Nikki Haley says, if they don't stop sending fentanyl here, I'm going to end trade relations with China. Well, last year, we imported nearly $600 billion in goods from China, and we exported nearly $350 billion to China. I can't imagine that she means we're going to end that. But think about, if she does mean it, what that would do to the country's economy. It would cripple our economy. It would send us into a deep recession, if not a depression. And this is, again, TV tough guy talk. I'm going to end trade relations with China. No, you're not. But you're going to make people who are scared of China feel like you're tough on China. The same way Trump said he made the greatest trade deal ever. Well, the statistics show, just take the agricultural side of it to start. They have complied with only 40% of what they promised in the trade deal in terms of purchases from our farmers. Only 40%. And he did nothing while he was in office, and Biden's done nothing to enforce that trade deal. I mean, this is what happens when you have people who make promises that sound good on TV, but they don't deliver on them. And so I'm not going to overpromise here. We are going to have an adversarial relationship with China for decades going forward. They are going to be our #1 competitor in the world. It has descended into a bit of a Cold War. What I think the next president's job is to pull it out of Cold War and make it an appropriate competition that doesn't lead to warfare. Because war with China would lead to millions dead. And we shouldn't back away from that if we were forced to, but we should be doing everything we can to avoid it. And that's why I think they're our biggest threat.
Well,
Thanks for the time. Great questions.
I do intend to sneak one more in. So 8 years ago, you showed up as governor of New Jersey, looking to be president. Now you're here again. What have you learned in 8 years? What would you do differently now than you would have then as a candidate for president?
Now, I think I'm much more mature than I was 8 years ago. I think I'm more reasoned. I think I'm more worldly. Those 8 years have helped make me a more mature, better leader. It made me a better listener than I was 8 years ago. And I think having power and leaving power, which I did after I was term limited after 8 years, and then being back in the private sector again, gives you a whole different perspective on things as well. And all those things have contributed to me to be better. I've also, I think, watched some pretty terrible leaders over the last 8 years. And that teaches you too, of what not to do, how not to act, and what the ramifications are for acting in a way that's blustery and immature. What that does inside your own country and what it does for America's image around the world. And so all those things have helped make me a better president. And I think, when people first started asking me to run for president, it was 2011. It was 13 years ago. And I said no back then because I knew I wasn't ready to be president. That seems like a quaint theory after the last number of years, but I really believed in my heart I wasn't ready to be president, so I didn't run in 2012. And in 2016, I was much more ready than I was in 2012 and felt like it was time to try. By 2024, I know that there would be no on-the-job training necessary. I would go in with the attitude, the experience, and the ability to listen that can help to make you the most effective leader you can be. I think also, best thing I'd say is the ability and even the willingness to admit when you make mistakes. Our system is not one that encourages that, but I think it's extraordinarily important to admit when you've made mistakes. And I made mistakes over the course of my career. I think they were all well-intentioned, but still wrong. And in the end, I think you need to be able to acknowledge that, to let people know, one, it's okay to make mistakes. We're all human. If you're looking for the perfect candidate, you're not going to find that person. And two, it also gives an open door to those who advise you to challenge you. Because if you show that you're willing to admit you've made mistakes, they know that you're willing to be challenged. And the thing that I fear the most about a Trump administration would be that no one that he brings around him this time will challenge him. And that is a horribly, horribly dangerous place for our country to be, to have a president who has no one around him who would be willing to challenge him. And I've surrounded myself with people who challenge me all the time. And the more mature I've gotten, the better I am at taking it, and taking it in and listening and correcting my own behavior or re-examining my own approaches to take in that kind of advice. And sometimes I don't agree with it. And if I don't, that's fine. If you're the leader, you're the decider, and you have to make the decisions and live with the ramifications.
Well, appreciate your answer and your honesty and for taking the time to speak with us today.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Thank you all for the time. I appreciate it very much, and look forward to January 23rd, and appreciate the fact that you all are playing an active role in it. So it's a great experience running up here. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank